illusions and reality. When you hear the word Japan, bright pictures immediately pop up in your head: the flowering sakura, ancient temples, Tokyo neon lights, smiling people in a kimono and, of course, land on every corner. It seems that this is a country of dreams where everything is perfect and every tourist feels like an anime hero. I also once believed in this image until I was here myself. From the first minutes in Japan you catch yourself thinking, everything is not as simple as it seems in photographs and in films. Here is an example from life. I flew to Tokyo late in the evening, tired after a long flight, and was sure that I would quickly get to the hotel. But reality was different. It turned out that the metro closes quite early, and the taxi costs like a ticket to an airplane. Even then, I realized Japan knows how to surprise, and not always pleasant. Many tourists come here with high expectations. We expect that everything will be convenient, it is clear that every passerby will help us navigate, and the service will be on top. But Japan is a country where there are own rules and traditions, and they can be a real test for those who are used to Western comfort. For example, I was sure that I could explain in English at least at the airport, but even there they did not always understand me, and sometimes they simply shy to answer. Japan is a country of contrasts. Here, ultramodern trains are adjacent to the ancient temples, and robots with traditional tea ceremonies. But behind this beautiful picture, details are hidden, which sometimes confuse. For example, I dreamed of seeing Sakura in silence, but I was among a huge crowd of the same dreamers, where everyone was fighting for the best angle for the photo. It is important to understand, Japan is not bad and not good, it is just very, very different. Here it is easy to feel like a stranger, face unexpected rules and understand that familiar things work in a completely different way. If you are ready to find out why a trip here can become not only enthusiasm, but also a real test, stay with me. Then I will tell you 20 reasons that will make you think about whether to fly to the country of the rising sun or look for something else for yourself. Overtourism, crowds, queues and a crush. If you dream of Japan as a place of solitude, where you can safely walk around the ancient streets and enjoy the silence of temples, then reality can be very surprised. Overtourism is perhaps one of the most unexpected problems that every second traveler faces in Japan. This is especially felt in large cities and popular tourist places. Imagine, you come in the early morning to the famous temple of Fusimi Inari in Kyoto, hoping to take a beautiful photo among the scarlet gates. But already at 7 in the morning there is a crowd of people, and everyone is trying to catch a successful shot. The queues are built not only at the entrance, but also for each photogenic point. In Tokyo, the situation is no better. Such places as the intersection of Shibuya or the Asakis district are literally boiling from the number of tourists. Sometimes even just walking along the street becomes a real test. You are pushed from all sides, and the noise does not subside for a minute. Crowds are felt not only on the street, but also in transport. During the peak hours in trains and metro, you can feel like a sardina in a bank. I once fell into this situation. I stood in a wagon, where there was not a single free centimeter, and I even had to breathe carefully so as not to hurt my neighbors. For many, this becomes real stress, especially if you are used to a more free space. Overtourism affects not only comfort, but also impressions of the country. Sometimes, due to the number of people, it is impossible to calmly consider the sights, and the atmosphere of solitude and peace is simply lost. Even in small cities and in natural objects, for example, at Mount Fuji or in the bamboo grove of Arasium, you will meet huge groups of tourists with cameras and guides. This problem is especially noticeable in the flowering season of Sakura or autumn maple leaf fall, when millions of guests from around the world come to Japan. In such periods, housing prices take off, and free places in trains and hotels become real. Sometimes you have to book everything in a few months in advance to just get to the right place. Overtourism is not just inconvenience, but a real factor that can spoil the impression even from the most beautiful corners of Japan. Therefore, if you do not like crowds and queues, prepare for the fact that in Japan there will be very, very many of them. Overloaded transport, metro and trains to the limit. Japan is famous for its developed transport system, and many tourists rejoice in advance the opportunity to ride on the famous high-speed trains or to feel like the hero of the film, standing on the Tokyo Metro platform. But reality is much less romantic. Overloaded transport is what almost every traveler encounters, especially in large cities. In Tokyo, Kyoto, Osaka and other metro megacities train are the main way to move for millions of people. During the peak hours of the platform, they are filled so much that it seems as if the whole city has gathered in one place. I remember how one morning I decided to go on an excursion to the Tokyo Center and got into a real transport whirlwind. People stood shoulder to shoulder, and when the train drove up, special employees, they are called guns, neatly, but persistently pushed passengers into the cars to fit everyone. The doors were closed literally at the last moment, and there was no centimeter of free space inside. For those who are not used to such close communication, a trip to the Japanese metro can be a real test. It is impossible to turn in the car, get the phone or even raise your hand. Sometimes it seems that you are just a part of a huge human stream that moves on a schedule without stopping for a second. It is especially difficult for those who travel with luggage or children. For them, the trip turns into a quest to survival. In addition, it is not easy to understand the metro scheme and railways. In Tokyo alone, several independent lines work, each has its own tickets and transplant rules. I have repeatedly seen how tourists were lost at the stations, trying to understand which ticket to buy and where to go further. Even navigation in English does not always save, signs can be confusing, and the names of the stations are similar to each other. Another feature is high travel prices. Unlike many countries where a unified payment system operates, in Japan, the ticket cost depends on the distance, and if you made a mistake with the route, you will have to pay extra. Ticket machines are often only in Japanese, and employees do not always speak English. All this turns trips to Japan into a real test for attentiveness, patience, and endurance. If you are used to free space and simple routes, be prepared. Japanese transport is a separate adventure where every day begins with the struggle for a place in the carriage. Language barrier, when Google Translate is powerless. Many travelers are sure that in the modern world English opens all doors, especially in such a high-tech country as Japan. But reality quickly arranges everything in its place. The language barrier here is not just inconvenience, and sometimes a real wall through which it is not so easy to break through. Even in large cities, where, it would seem, there should be many tourists, not every Japanese speaks English. In stores, cafes, stations and even in hotels you can encounter the fact that the staff understands only the simplest phrases or does not speak foreign languages at all. I remember once trying to order dinner in a small family restaurant in Kyoto. The menu was only in Japanese, and the waitress was shy even to try to explain something in English. As a result, we simply poked a finger at the picture, hoping that they would bring something delicious. There are no signs in English everywhere. In some areas, even in Tokyo, only hieroglyphs can be found, and then you have to rely on intuition or the help of passers-by. But here is not everything simple. The Japanese are very polite, but often hesitate to speak a foreign language, even if they know him a little. Sometimes they just smile and apologize, without the risk of joining dialogue. Technologies are also not always saved. Transfer applications, such as Google Translate, sometimes translate phrases too literally or with errors. It is especially difficult with a menu in restaurants where rare hieroglyphs or specific dishes are used. I once tried with the help of the phone to find out if there was a fish in the dish, and received a completely absurd translation, which only confused the waiter. It is especially difficult for those who travel to small cities or villages. There is English a real rarity, and local residents may never meet foreigners at all. In such places, even buying a bus ticket or finding the right stop turns into a quest. The language barrier in Japan is not just a petty trouble. It affects everything, from ordering food to searching for the desired address. If you do not know the Japanese language, get ready for the fact that sometimes you have to rely on gestures, smiles, and good luck. This adds adventures, but requires patience and sense of humor. Problems with the internet and connection. In the age of technology, it seems that you can connect to the internet anywhere, especially in a modern country as Japan. But in reality, the situation is much more complicated than many tourists expect. Problems with access to the network and mobile communications can be taken by surprise even experienced travelers. The first thing that surprises is the limitations of free Wi-Fi. In large cities like Tokyo and Osaka, there are free internet in some cafes, hotels, and shopping centers. But even there, the quality of the connection leaves much to be desired, the speed can be very low, and the connection often requires registration in Japanese, which in itself turns into a separate test. In public transport, on the streets and in most restaurants, a free internet is rather an exception than the rule. Mobile internet is also not so simple. There are several options for tourists: renting a portable Wi-Fi router, buying a local SIM card, or using international roaming. But each method has its own pitfalls. For example, to buy a SIM card, you often need to present a passport and fill out a questionnaire in Japanese. Some operators sell SIM cards only for long-term residents, and tourist options are quite expensive and do not always provide a stable connection. I once decided to use the portable Wi-Fi router, which is issued directly at the airport. It would seem convenient: you connect all your devices and walk around the city. But after a couple of hours it turned out that the battery was not holding a charge for long, and the signal could disappear in the subway or in buildings with thick walls. I had to constantly look for sockets so as not to be left without communication. In some areas, especially outside the megacities, a mobile network can work unstable or completely absent. This becomes a real problem if you are used to using online cards, translators, and navigators. Once I went on an excursion to a small town and suddenly left without the internet. Finding the right address was not a task of not lungs. Problems with the internet and connection in Japan are not just inconvenience, but a real factor that can affect the entire route and mood. If you are used to being always online, prepare for the fact that in Japan you will have to show ingenuity and patience in order to remain in touch. Cultural shock, rules and prohibitions at every step. Japan is a country where traditions and norms of behavior play a huge role in everyday life. For a tourist, this can be a real cultural shock. Here, literally at every step, their own, sometimes very strict, rules, and ignorance of them can lead to awkward situations or even cause the discontent of others. The first thing that catches your eye is incredible politeness and formality. The Japanese are used to observing the distance, not to show emotions in public, and always follow the established standards. For example, it is considered extremely impolite to talk loudly in transport or by phone, and laughter or violent discussions can cause a disapproving look. I once accidentally spoke a little louder in the subway car, and immediately felt how everyone around was silent and began to avoid visual contact. Particular attention is paid to the rules of conduct in public places. You can only smoke in specially designated areas, and an attempt to smoke on the street may end with a fine. The same applies to garbage. Waste can be thrown out only in strictly defined places, and there is practically no urbanization on the streets. I have repeatedly watched the tourists in confusion went with empty bottles and wrappers, not knowing where to put them. In Japan, there are less obvious prohibitions. For example, taking pictures in some temples, museums, or even on the streets is prohibited. Special signs are warned about this, but not always in English. I was once carried away by the shooting in the ancient quarter of Kyoto and only then noticed that the locals were looking with obvious discontent. It turned out that it was not customary to photograph people in traditional costumes without their permission. Another feature is strict rules regarding tips. In Japan, it is not customary to leave tips, and an attempt to do this can put the staff in an awkward position. In restaurants, hotels, and taxis, they expect only payment from you, without additional thanks. Even such trifles as removing shoes at the entrance to the house, hotel, or some restaurants may be a surprise. Once I almost entered the traditional Rodin in street shoes, and only in time I noticed a pile of slippers at the entrance. All this is only a small part of the cultural nuances that a tourist faces in Japan. It is important to be attentive to details, respect local traditions, and not be afraid to ask if something is incomprehensible. A cultural shock in Japan is not only a surprise, but also a great occasion to look at the world in a new way, unless, of course, you are ready for unexpected discoveries. Garbage and sorting of waste, a quest for a foreigner. In Japan, the attitude towards garbage and its sorting is a whole science that is able to at a standstill of even the most experienced travelers. Here they do not just care about ecology, but turn waste disposal into a real ritual with many strict rules. For a tourist, this can be one of the most unexpected and complex tests. The first thing that catches the eye is an almost complete absence of urns on the streets. Even in large cities like Tokyo or Osaka, you can pass several quarters and not meet a single garbage basket. I remember how once after a snack on the street I was looking for a long time where to throw the wrapping, and eventually carried it with him until the hotel returned. The reason is simple: the Japanese are used to picking up the garbage home and sort it already there, and not throw it out on the street. Sorting of waste is a separate story. Each prefecture and even in each area has its own rules and its own categories of garbage. Plastic, paper, glass, aluminum, food waste, large-sized garbage, all this is thrown separately and on certain days of the week. If you make a mistake with the sorting or make garbage on the wrong day, the package may simply not be taken, and sometimes even attach a note to it with an explanation of the error. It can be very difficult for a tourist to understand all these nuances. Instructions, as a rule, are written only in Japanese, and the waste collection containers themselves look the same. I once stood in front of 3 different tanks at the entrance to the store for a long time, trying to understand where to throw a plastic bottle. As a result, I had to ask passers-by who readily explained, but did it with obvious surprise. Not every day they have to help foreigners with garbage. In some places, for example, in hotels or stations, there are special containers for tourists, but they're often you have to guess what and where to throw it away. An error in sorting can cause staff discontent or even lead to a fine. In some areas they are especially strictly monitored, and local residents can make a remark if they see that you are throwing garbage incorrectly. All this turns the usual task, to get rid of waste, into a real quest that requires attentiveness, patience, and respect for local rules. If you are used to the fact that there are urns at every step, Japan will surprise you from the first days. Here, garbage is not just an everyday question, but a part of the culture that needs to be studied and respected in order not to get into an awkward situation. Problems with payment and exchange of currency. In Japan, financial issues can be a real test for a tourist, especially if you are used to the convenience of bank cards and mobile payments. Despite the reputation of a high-tech country, here in many places they still prefer cash, and modern payment methods are accepted far from everywhere. The first thing that surprises is the limitations of the use of bank cards. Even in large cities, in restaurants, small stores, markets, and in some museums they can only take cash. I once found myself in a situation where, after a long walk, I went to a cozy cafe in the center of Tokyo, and at the checkout it turned out that the cards were not accepted here. I had to look for the nearest ATM, and this is not always simple. Many ATMs only work with Japanese cards or have a limited working hours. Currency exchange is another puzzle. In airports and large hotels, you can exchange money quickly, but the course is usually not the most profitable. In cities, exchange offices are much less common than in Europe or America, and some of them are closed early in the evening. In small cities or tourist areas, find an exchange point real luck. Sometimes you have to plan a budget in advance and withdraw a large amount at once, so as not to be left without money at the most inopportune moment. Mobile payments and electronic wallets, such as Apple Pay or Google Pay, are supported only in separate networks and stores. Japanese counterparts, for example, Suica or Pasmo, are convenient to pay for transport and small purchases, but cash or a Japanese bank card is often required to replenish them. For foreigners, this becomes an additional obstacle. Another feature is the commission and restrictions on cash withdrawal. In some ATMs, the commission can be quite high, and the maximum amount for withdrawal is limited. It happens that the ATM simply does not accept your card, and you have to look for another, which is especially inconvenient late in the evening or in remote areas. All these nuances make the financial side of the trip to Japan not the easiest. If you are used to cashless payments and do not want to constantly carry large amounts with you, Japan can surprise you with its conservatism in payment matters. It is important here to think in advance where and how you will change money, and always have a stock of cash in case of unexpected situations. The high cost of housing and food. Japan often surprises tourists not only its color, but also the cost of living and nutrition. This is especially felt in large cities and popular tourist places where prices may seem overstated even for experienced travelers. The high cost of housing and food is one of those reasons that can ruin the impression of the trip, if not ready for it in advance. Let's start with housing. In Tokyo, Kyoto, Osaka, and other megacities, the cost of an overnight stay in a mid-level hotel can be several times higher than in most European capitals. Even a small room in a business hotel or capsule hotel will cost a little, especially in the flowering season of sakura or autumn leaf fall, when the demand for housing increases significantly. I once booked a hotel room a few months before the trip, but even then the price in one night was higher than I expected. At the last moment, it is almost impossible to find something available. Free places are disassembled very quickly. Alternatives, such as renting apartments through popular services, are also not always saved. Firstly, Japan has strict laws that limit short-term lease for foreigners. Secondly, many owners require an advance payment and a deposit, and sometimes a copy of the passport. As a result, even the budget option may not be so cheap, and the living conditions very modest. Now about nutrition. Japanese cuisine is famous for its diversity, but to eat in a restaurant or cafe is not cheap pleasure. In tourist areas, lunch or dinner prices can be 2 to 3 times higher than in similar institutions of other Asian countries. Even simple dishes, such as ramen or sushi, are more expensive in popular places. I once went to a regular cafe in the center of Kyoto and was surprised when the noodles and tea had to pay for the amount for which in other countries you can eat the three. Hidden expenses are another unpleasant feature. In many restaurants, a tax on service or fee for the applied snacks is added to the account, even if you did not order them. Sometimes additional fees for cleaning, using the internet or even for leasing towels are added to the cost of living in the hotel. If you count on savings, you should be prepared for the fact that there are not so many cheap supermarkets and street foods as, for example, in the countries of Southeast Asia. Of course, you can find stores with ready-made dinners or inexpensive snacks, but even their prices will be higher than the usual ones. The high cost of housing and food in Japan is not just a budget issue, but a factor that affects the entire trip style. It is important here to plan expenses in advance, book housing as soon as possible, and be prepared for the fact that some pleasures will have to be limited for the sake of new impressions. Difficulties with housing, Airbnb, capsule hotels, and traditional rods. In Japan, the choice of housing seems huge, from modern hotels and cozy apartments to unusual capsule hotels and traditional rods. But behind this variety hides many difficulties that almost every tourist faces, especially if you want to save or get a unique experience. Let's start with the most popular housing rental services, such as Airbnb. In recent years, Japan has tightened laws for short-term rental, and now not every owner can legally rent an apartment. Many ads disappeared from sites, and the remaining often require confirmation of reservation a few months in advance. Sometimes the owners ask to send a copy of the passport, fill out a long questionnaire, or even contact the video for checking the personality. It happens that after booking it turns out, housing is not available to the desired dates, or the owner suddenly cancels the reservation at the last moment. All this adds stress and requires constant control over the correspondence and rental conditions. Capsule hotels are another visiting card of Japan. They look futuristic and attract many tourists with their unusualness. But in reality, the capsule is just a small space where you can only lie and store a minimum of things. Inside is very crowded, and the personal space is practically absent. I once spent a night at such a hotel in Tokyo and realized that for a tall person or for those who do not like closed spaces, this could be a real test. In addition, strict rules often apply in capsule hotels. You can't speak by phone, it is forbidden to eat in a capsule, and shower and toilet are common to all guests. For families with children or the elderly, this option is not suitable. Traditional rodents are Japanese hotels where you can feel the atmosphere of antiquity, tatami on the floor, paper partitions, a bath with hot springs. But here there are nuances. Firstly, the cost of living in ryokan is usually higher than in a regular hotel. Secondly, the rules of conduct may seem difficult for foreigners. It is necessary to take off shoes, observe silence, and sometimes even adhere to a certain schedule of food and bathing. I once stopped in ryokan in Kyoto and almost late for dinner, because I did not know that he was served strictly at a certain time. Another difficulty is the small size of the rooms and the lack of familiar amenities. Even in modern hotels, rooms can be very compact, and cabinets and shelves are minimal. Sometimes there is not even a chair or desktop in the room, and the bathroom is so small that it is not easy to turn around in it. All these features make the search and booking of housing in Japan a real quest. It is important to study the living conditions in advance, read reviews, and be prepared for the fact that the usual comfort will have to look for longer than usual. If you dream of a unique experience, Japan will definitely surprise you, but for this you will have to show flexibility and patience. Overtourism and destruction of the atmosphere. In recent years, Japan has become one of the most popular areas for traveling, and this could not but affect the country's atmosphere. Overtourism, a phenomenon when the number of tourists exceeds the possibilities of local infrastructure, is especially acute here. These are not only the queues and crowds that I already talked about, but also the gradual destruction of the same authentic atmosphere, for which many go to Japan. First of all, historical cities and natural attractions suffer. Kyoto, once calm and peaceful, today into peak seasons turns into a real anthill. Narrow streets, which once walked monks and artists, are now filled with tourist groups with flags, guides and cameras. I once tried to walk around the famous Gion district in the early morning to enjoy silence, but at 8 in the morning it was not possible to push around here. Locals are increasingly complaining about the noise, garbage and disrespectful behavior of guests. Overtourism also affects nature. For example, Arasayama Bamboo Grove, one of the most photographed places in Japan, has long been not like that calm corner that is shown in guidebooks. Crowds of people literally trample paths, and for the sake of a successful frame, tourists often go to the fences, damaging the plants. I saw how the park employees unsuccessfully tried to explain to the guests that it was impossible to touch the bamboo and leave the paths, but the stream of people does not decrease. In some places, local residents are forced to change the usual lifestyle due to the influx of tourists. Small family shops and traditional shops give way to souvenir kiosks and network cafes. Even in small villages, where only lovers of the Japanese hinterland came before, now buses with excursion groups appear. This leads to the fact that authenticity is lost, and the atmosphere becomes more and more commercial and artificial. Another problem is the oversaturation of transport and infrastructure. In the flowering season of sakura or autumn leaf fall, train tickets and buses are sold out in a few weeks, and popular routes become almost inaccessible to local residents. The Japanese are sometimes forced to change their plans in order to avoid crowds, and some even leave the city during the tourist boom. Overtourism is not just an inconvenience for guests, but also a serious test for Japan itself. If you dream of seeing the country as it is shown in films and books, be prepared for the fact that reality may be completely different. The atmosphere of solitude and tranquility here is becoming increasingly rare, and to find it, you will have to look for little-known routes in Kumano low season. Environmental problems, garbage, erosion, and harm to nature. Japan is often associated with purity and careful attitude to nature, but in reality environmental problems here become more noticeable, especially in popular tourist places. One of the main troubles is the garbage that remains after a huge number of guests. Despite the strict rules of sorting and the absence of urn, many tourists do not know or ignore local norms, as a result of which the waste accumulates in the most unexpected places. This problem is especially acute at natural attractions. For example, Mount Fuji, which hundreds of thousands of people visit annually, suffers from garbage left on paths and parking. Even despite the efforts of volunteers and special cleaning shares, plastic bottles, wrappers and packaging continue to appear on the slopes. I saw how local residents collect waste after tourists, but it becomes more difficult to cope with such a stream of garbage. Another serious problem is soil erosion. A large number of people passing along the same paths leads to the destruction of the natural landscape. In bamboo groves, on alpine paths and lakes, you can see how the earth becomes naked and the plants are trampled. This not only spoils the appearance, but also harms the ecosystem. Rare species of plants and animals disappear, water balance is disturbed. In some regions, even animals suffer. For example, in the parks of the bunks where manual deer live, tourists often feed them with inappropriate food or lit up directly on the lawns. This leads to animal diseases and the deterioration of their habitat. I once watched the park employees explain to tourists that you can only feed deer with special crackers, but not all guests follow these tips. In the coastal areas and on the islands, the situation is no better. Popular beaches and places for diving suffer from plastic garbage, which brings not only the sea, but also vacationers themselves. In some places, volunteers regularly arrange subbotniks, but waste volumes continue to grow. Environmental problems in Japan are not only the care of local residents, but also the responsibility of everyone who comes here. If you want to preserve the beauty of this country for future generations, it is important to respect nature, remove garbage, and follow the rules. This is the only way to make a contribution to the preservation of the unique corners of Japan so that they please not only you, but also everyone who will come hereafter. Cultural misunderstandings and passive aggression. Japan is a country with a very complex system of social norms and invisible boundaries, which is not always easy for a foreigner. Even if you try to behave respectfully, you can accidentally break the local rules or get into an awkward situation. Cultural misunderstandings here happen much more often than it seems at first glance, and the reaction of others can be unexpected for those who are used to open communication. One of the features of Japanese culture is to avoid direct conflicts and open expression of discontent. If you accidentally did something wrong, they are unlikely to tell you about it directly. Instead, you may encounter passive aggression, a cold look, silent ignoring, or a polite, but alienated smile. I once noticed that after an unsuccessful attempt to photograph the window in the store, the seller began to answer me very briefly and without enthusiasm, although formally everything looked politely. In public places, especially in transport and restaurants, the Japanese are expected from guests of compliance with certain norms of behavior. For example, loud conversations, laughter, or attempts to enter into a friendly dialogue with strangers can be perceived as an invasion of personal space. If you accidentally violated the silence or took someone else's place, most likely you will not make a remark. But the atmosphere around it can change dramatically, people will stop looking in your direction, and the staff will serve you as formally as possible. It is especially difficult for those who come to Japan for the first time and do not know all the intricacies of etiquette. For example, in restaurants it is not customary to ask to change the composition of the dish or ask for additional spices. I once asked to make the dish less sharp, and the waitress nodded politely, but brought everything in standard form. Later I learned that such requests are considered a violation of traditions and can put the cooks in an awkward position. In some cases, foreigners are faced with obvious distrust or even hidden hostility. For example, when checking in a hotel or renting housing, they may ask for additional documents or refuse without explanation. In small cities and villages, local residents sometimes avoid communicating with tourists, preferring to stay at a distance. This does not mean that the Japanese are unfriendly, they are just used to their way of life and are not always ready to openly accept other people's rules. Cultural misunderstandings and passive aggression are part of the Japanese reality, which you need to be prepared for. It is important not to take everything to the personal account, to show patience and respect for local customs. If you are ready to learn from your mistakes and perceive everything with humor, such situations can become not only a test, but also a valuable experience that will help to understand the Japanese culture deeper. Detailing, shocking household little things. When you come to Japan, it seems that everything will work like a clock, and life will be as convenient and thought out as possible. But in practice, it is the little things that can surprise or even shock, especially if you are used to Western comfort. Japanese everyday life is full of unexpected details that can confuse and cause a lot of questions. The first thing that catches your eye is paid packages in stores. Even if you buy only one bottle of water or chocolate, you will have to pay extra for a plastic bag. Moreover, the seller will definitely clarify whether you need a package, and if you do not answer on time, they simply will not give him. I was once at a loss at the checkout because I did not know how to ask for a bag correctly, and in the end I left the store with purchases in my hands. The next moment is to sort garbage even in hotels and apartments. In some hotels there are several small lead irons in the room, for plastic, for paper, for food waste. Sometimes a long instruction in Japanese is attached to them. If you throw everything into one basket, the staff can make a remark or just leave the garbage in the room until your departure. Shower in bathrooms in Japan is a separate topic. Even in modern hotels, the bathroom can be very small, and the shower cabin is so compact that it is difficult to turn into it. In some places, the soles are combined with the toilet, and the drain is located directly on the floor. I once lived in a hotel where the washing crane was built directly into the toilet tank. This is a typical Japanese saving space. Another household feature is the lack of familiar services. For example, not all hotels have ironing boards, teapots, or even clothes cabinets. Sometimes instead of a closet, just a few hangers on the wall. In some apartments there is no microwave or stove, and the dishes must be washed manually, because dishwashers are extremely rare. Many tourists are surprised that in Japan it is not customary to eat on the go. If you bought a snack in the store, it is better to find a place for food or return to the hotel. There is considered impolite on the street, and the locals can look with disapproval. I once decided to eat on a bench in the park, and felt the surprised glances of passers-by. Even such trifles such as the lack of napkins in a cafe or the need to take off shoes in front of the entrance to some stores may be a surprise. In some places you will be given special shoes or slippers, and if you forget to put them on, the staff politely reminds of this. All this is only part of the household details that a tourist faces in Japan. They do not make the country worse, but require attention and readiness for new rules. If you treat these trifles with interest and humor, they can become bright memories and an occasion for funny stories about your journey. Overload of popular attractions. Many go to Japan for the sake of famous temples, gardens, parks, and natural miracles, expecting to find their silence and harmony there, which are so often written in guidebooks. But reality often turns out to be completely different. Popular attractions are so overloaded that it is really almost impossible to enjoy them. One of the most striking examples is the temples of Kyoto. It would seem that these places are created for meditation and calm walks. In fact, the entrance to the famous Golden Pavilion or the Kiyomizu-dera temple begins with a long line, and inside the tourists go with a dense column, almost without linger in the altars and gardens. I once arrived at the temple of Fusimi Inari in the early morning, hoping to take a photo among the scarlet gates without people, but at 7 o'clock in the morning it was not there. Everyone is looking for the best angle, and sometimes even have to wait for their turn to just go along the path. Overload is felt in natural locations. For example, Arasayama Bamboo Grove looks in photographs as an ideal place for solitude, but in reality there are crowds of people with cameras, and silence is broken by a constant hum of conversations. In the flowering season of sakura or autumn leaf fall, the situation becomes even more difficult. The parks and gardens are clogged to capacity, and the free space on the bench is real luck. The problem is especially acute in places where restrictions on photographing are valid. In some temples and museums, shooting is prohibited, but not all tourists know or respect it. I saw how the staff of the temples politely, but persistently asked the guests to remove cameras, and some even put special signs in several languages. Nevertheless, the desire to take a beautiful frame with you is often stronger than the rules. In some cases, overload leads to the fact that local residents are trying to avoid popular attractions, and the atmosphere of solitude and peace simply disappears. Even in small cities, where before you could calmly walk along the streets, now groups of tourists with guides and flags are increasingly found. If you dream of seeing Japan what it is shown in films and on postcards, you should be prepared for the fact that you will have to share this pleasure with hundreds, and sometimes thousands of other people. The best way to avoid disappointment is to come in a low season, look for little-known routes and be prepared for the fact that there are fewer ideal solitude here. Problems with food, not for everyone. Japan is a real paradise for lovers of exotic cuisine and gastronomic discoveries. But for many tourists, local food becomes not only a source of delight, but also the cause of serious difficulties. Problems with nutrition may arise among vegetarians, allergies, people with special diets, as well as those who are simply not ready for experiments. Firstly, Japanese cuisine is very different from the usual European or American. Even such seemingly familiar dishes, such as land or ramen, may contain unexpected ingredients, raw fish, seaweed, fermented products, unusual spices. I once ordered soup, which looked quite usually, but turned out to be so sharp and specific to taste that even me, accustomed to Asian cuisine, could not at the end. Vegetarians and vegans in Japan are especially difficult. Even if the dish looks like a vegetable, it often uses a fish broth, oysters, or other animal products. I tried to explain in the restaurant that I did not eat the fish, but the waitress could not understand why I refused the traditional miso soup after all. It has only a little fish powder. As a result, in order to be confident in the composition of the dish, you have to study Japanese hieroglyphs or carry cards with a translation with you. People with food allergies need to be especially careful. In Japan, it is not customary to describe in detail the composition of the dishes in the menu, and the staff cannot always explain what exactly is included in the recipe. I met tourists who brought special cards with them with a listing allergens in Japanese, but even this did not always help to avoid unpleasant surprises. Another difficulty is the language barrier. In small cafes and family restaurants, the menu is often only on Japanese,
and photos of dishes do not always reflect their real composition. Sometimes you just have to indicate the image you like and hope for good luck. It happens that they are not at all what expected, and you have to eat out of politeness so as not to offend the owners. For those who are not ready for experiments, it is not easy to find familiar Western food. Of course, in large cities there are international fast food networks, but the prices are higher, and the taste is different from the usual one. In supermarkets, you can buy ready-made dinners, but also there are most options with fish, seafood, or meat. Problems with food in Japan is not only a matter of taste, but also part of cultural experience. If you are ready to try new and relate to surprises with humor, gastronomic adventures can become a bright part of the trip. But if you have a strict diet or allergy, you should prepare in advance, study the composition of dishes and always have a spare snack on hand. Expectations versus reality, anime, manga, and infantilism. Many go to Japan, inspired by images from anime, manga, and films. It seems that here every day you can meet the heroes of your favorite cartoons, see cosplay on the streets and plunge into the atmosphere of an endless holiday. But reality is much more complicated and does not always coincide with expectations. Firstly, anime and manga really occupy an important place in Japanese culture, but this does not mean that everything around resembles a cartoon world. On the streets of Tokyo or Osaka, you rarely find adults in characters. Cosplay here is more an exception than a rule, and most often it can only be seen at special festivals or in areas like Akihabara. I once specially went to this quarter to see the famous cosplayers, but I found that most passers-by are dressed very modestly and strictly, and the atmosphere is not at all like the one that is shown in the anime. Another disappointment is the cult of Molota, which penetrates literally everything, from advertising to packaging goods. In Japan, everything is very fond of bright, children's and funny, and even official documents or train tickets can be decorated with cartoon characters. For some tourists, this seems funny, but over time begins to tire. Especially if you expect to see strict and restrained Japan from historical films. Infantilism in culture is also manifested in everyday life. In stores, cafes, and even in business quarters you can meet adults with accessories in the form of plush toys, backpacks with cartoon characters and bright key fobs. I was once at a business meeting, where my interlocutor, an adult man in a strict suit, took a notebook from a portfolio with the image of a popular anime office. This is part of Japanese culture, but for some guests it may seem strange or even inappropriate. Expectations from Japan based on anime and manga often do not coincide with reality. There are no universal fun and permanent festivals, and adults behave much more restrained than cartoon characters. Many tourists experience a slight disappointment when they understand that real life in Japan is much calmer, stricter, and even more conservative than it seems at first glance. If you are going to Japan in search of a fairy tale from anime, you should be prepared for the fact that this is only one side of culture, and not everyday reality. There is a place for both Molota and for traditions, but the main thing is not to build illusions and be open to real, sometimes very adult and serious Japan. Social problems, loneliness, hikikomori, and depression. Japan often impresses guests with its external harmony, purity, and organization. But behind this beautiful picture, serious social problems are hidden, which rarely fall into tourist guides. One of the most noticeable is loneliness, which is especially acute here, despite huge cities and a constant stream of people. In Japan, the level of social isolation is very high. Many residents, especially in megacities, live alone, work until late and almost do not communicate with their neighbors. Even in a crowded train or on a noisy street, you can feel completely lonely. I have repeatedly noticed that in cafes and restaurants many people are sitting at tables alone, immersed in a phone or book, and almost do not talk to each other. A special phenomenon of Japanese culture is hikikomori. This is the name of people who are deliberately isolated from society, do not leave the house for weeks or even months, limiting contacts with the outside world to a minimum. According to various estimates, there are hundreds of thousands in Japan. The reasons can be different: stress at work, the pressure of society, fear of failure. For a foreigner, this side of the life of Japan may seem shocking and sad. An equally serious problem is depression and psychological pressure. In Japanese society, it is customary to hide their emotions, not to complain and not show weakness. This leads to the fact that many people do not seek help even in difficult situations.
I heard stories about how employees work 12 to 4 hours a day, practically not seeing family and friends, and cannot afford to lose their jobs or bring the team. In recent years, special support services, hotlines and mutual assistance groups have appeared in Japan, but the problem remains relevant. For a tourist, this is manifested in the fact that local residents often seem closed, reluctantly come to contact and avoid personal conversations. Even if you try to have a friendly conversation, most likely you will get a polite but very formal answer. The social problems of Japan are not what is striking right away, but if you look closely, it becomes clear that many difficulties are hiding behind external well-being. Loneliness, isolation and psychological pressure are part of the modern Japanese reality, which is important to consider in order to better understand this amazing, but not always simple country.
Female questions, sexism and harassment.
Japan is a country where traditions and respect for the elders play a huge role, but, unfortunately, this also affects the situation of women in society. For tourists and just attentive guests, it becomes noticeable that gender equality here is still a problem, and some situations can cause bewilderment or even discomfort. Firstly, in Japan, patriarchal views are still strong. Women often face inequality at work, in education, and in everyday life. For example, in offices women often perform only auxiliary functions, rarely occupy leading positions and receive a lower salary compared to men. I talked with Japanese women who said that even with equal professional skills, it is more difficult for them to move along the career ladder.
The second important point is harassment in public places, especially in transport.
In the Japanese metro and trains there are special cars only for women who work during peak hours.
This is a forced measure. Unpleasant incidents occur in crowded wagons when women face undesirable attention or touch.
I talked with tourists who were surprised at the need to use such wagons and noted that even in the most modern cities the problem remains.
Women tourists should be especially attentive in crowded places and monitor personal things.
In some cases, local men can show excessive curiosity, especially if they see a foreigner alone. This is not always manifested openly, but can be expressed in close views or attempts to start a conversation without a reason.
Another feature is the attitude to appearance and age.
In Japan, youth and neat appearance are given great importance, and women often feel pressure from society. It is expected that they will always look perfect, behave modestly and not show emotions in public.
This also applies to tourists. Bright makeup, open clothes, or loud behavior can cause surprise or even condemnation.
In general, female issues in Japan are not only the internal problems of the country, but also what foreigners face during the trip. It is important to be attentive to the environment, observe local norms of behavior and do not hesitate to use special services, if necessary. Understanding these nuances will help to avoid unpleasant situations and make the trip more comfortable and safe.
Expectations from the service, not always a smile and care.
Japan has long been famous for its high level of service, and many tourists come here with the expectation of perfect service, polite staff, impeccable cleanliness and attentive attitude to each guest. But in practice, the service in Japan is not at all the same as in Western countries, and this may be a surprise even for experienced travelers.
Firstly, the Japanese service is very formalized.
The staff will always be polite, but this politeness is often official, not sincere in nature. For example, in a restaurant or store you will be welcome, but do not expect a friendly smile or an attempt to start a conversation. Everything is done according to the instructions, and any deviation from the standard procedure causes workers to be confused. I once asked the waiter in the cafe to serve a dish without a specific ingredient, and he apologized several times, but could not fulfill the request simply because this was not provided for by the rules.
Secondly, the Japanese service is not always flexible.
If you are accustomed to the fact that in Europe or America the staff tries to please the guest, everything is strictly according to the regulations. In hotels, for example, settlement begins strictly at a certain time, and even if your number is ready, you will be asked to wait until an official hour. Any requests that go beyond standard services can be met with bewilderment or even refusal. I faced the fact that at the hotel they could not give out an additional towel, because according to the rules each guest was entitled only by one. Another feature is the lack of familiar compliments or bonuses. In Japan, it is not customary to make discounts, offer free drinks or treats, even if you are a regular client. Everything is paid strictly according to the check, and tips are not only not welcome, but they can also put the staff in an awkward position. In some cases, the service may seem even cold. If you have a problem or a controversial situation, employees will apologize, but will not always be able to offer a solution. I once faced the fact that the air conditioner did not work in the hotel, and the staff only nodded and apologized, but could not fix anything until the end of my residence. Expectations from the Japanese service often do not coincide with reality. Everything here is built on respect for the rules, and not on an individual approach. If you are ready for such a system, the trip will be comfortable. But if you expect personal attention and flexibility, Japan can surprise you with its severity and formality. Results: to whom Japan is definitely not suitable. A journey to Japan is always a bright and memorable adventure, but it is not suitable for everyone. After all the described nuances, it becomes clear this country can be a real test for certain categories of tourists. If you value simplicity, spontaneity, and freedom on travel, Japan may seem too strict, formal, and even closed. Firstly, Japan is not suitable for those who do not like crowds, queues, and noise. Here, overtourism has become a real problem, and popular places are filled with people at any time of the year. If you dream of solitude and silence, you will have to look for little-known routes or come in a low season, and this is not always possible. Secondly, if you are not ready to constantly comply with the rules, study instructions, and adapt to local traditions, a trip to Japan can turn into a series of stressful situations. It is important to respect the norms of behavior, sort garbage, follow the established order, and not wait for someone to make an exception for you. Japan can also disappoint those who are used to a flexible service, an individual approach, and a quick solution to problems. Everything here is strictly according to the regulations, and any requests that go beyond standard services often remain unanswered. If you expect that the staff will meet and show the initiative, reality may be completely different. For people with a limited budget, Japan is also not always the best choice. High prices for housing, food, transport, and entertainment can quickly exhaust even well-planned savings. It is important to be prepared for additional expenses and plan each budget item in advance. It is especially difficult for those who do not know the Japanese language and are not ready for a language barrier. Even in large cities, many do not speak English, and navigation and instructions are often written only in Japanese. This requires patience, ingenuity, and ability to cope with surprises. Japan is a country for those who are open to new impressions, respects other people's traditions, and are not afraid to leave the comfort zone. If you are ready for cultural discoveries, unexpected household trifles, and characteristics of the local structure, the trip will give a lot of unique emotions. But if you are looking for lightness, familiar service, and full predictability, you may be worth considering other directions for travel. Conclusion: is it worth it to go? Alternative directions. After such a detailed analysis of all the difficulties and features of Japan, a logical question arises: is it worth going to this country at all? In fact, everyone has their own answer. Japan is not just another point on the map, but a whole world with its laws, traditions, and the rhythm of life. Here you can get a unique experience, see incredible contrasts, try unusual food, and plunge into an atmosphere that you will not meet anywhere else. But all this is accompanied by certain difficulties, for which you need to be prepared in advance. If you love order, respect other people's traditions, are ready to learn new things, and perceive surprises with humor, Japan will give you an unforgettable impressions. Here every day is a small adventure, or even a trip to a store or a trip to the subway turns into a quest. You will see how ancient temples and ultra-modern skyscrapers are combined. You will try dishes that you only read about before, and find out what a real cultural shock is. But if you are looking for lightness, spontaneity, friendly service, and the usual amenities, you may consider alternative directions. For example, in the countries of Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam, or Indonesia, you will find a warm welcome, affordable prices, a variety of kitchen, and much less strict rules. In South Korea and Taiwan, you can find a balance between modernity and traditions, while the language barrier and household little things will not be so complicated. Europe and America also offer a lot of interesting routes for those who value freedom and simplicity. In any case, the choice is always yours. Japan is a country for those who are ready for changes, is not afraid of difficulties, and knows how to see beauty in detail. If you feel that you are ready for such a test, feel free to go towards new discoveries. And if not, there are thousands of places in the world where you can spend an unforgettable vacation without unnecessary stress. The main thing is to travel with an open heart and curiosity, because this is what makes every trip really special. Do not forget about the useful services that we indicate in the fixed comments. Subscribe to the channel, like it. Good rest for everyone.